So Dr. Paul Ortiz is our speaker tonight. He obtained his PhD from Duke University in 2000. He's director of the award-winning Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, which has received at least 3 national academic awards. And he's currently professor of history at the University of Florida. And for the 2019-2022 term, he's also a University of Florida term professor, and those are highly competitive professorships at UF. His book, Emancipation Betrayed, The Hidden History of Black Organizing and White Violence in Florida from Reconstruction to the Bloody Election of 1920, was awarded the Harry T. and Harriet B. Moore Book Prize from the Florida Historical Society. I highly recommend that you read the book. I'm about halfway through it, and it just is so enlightening. And I do want to read just 2 sentences from this book as an introduction to his topic tonight, which is the Ocoee Massacre of the election night of 1920. And I quote, "American history has completely erased the martyrs of 1920. It is possible to walk through Tallahassee, the state capital of Florida, and have absolutely no inkling that one of the greatest democratic struggles of the nation's life occurred here." Dr. Ortiz, I will let you enlighten us, and I would ask everybody to mute. And then also, as questions come up, if you just put them into the chat, and then we'll also open it up for verbal questions too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elliott, for the kind introduction. And thank you to the League of Women Voters of Broward County. I'm honored and really thrilled to be here this evening. It's been a real whirlwind the past few years in the advances that we have all been able to make collectively as parents, as students, as educators, as organizers, especially in Western Orange County, but in other parts of the state. The statewide African American History Task Force has been very active in promoting the history of what happened in Ocoee in Florida in 1920. What I'd like to do tonight is to just talk about the Ocoee Massacre, the Election Day Massacre in Ocoee of 1920, kind of situate it nationally, and then also talk about how we've made some gains in terms of telling the story. As Monica alluded to, we have been able to pass a bill which mandates all school districts in the state of Florida as of last year to teach about this critical historical event in our nation's history. The bill came about as a part of a long history of struggle. I'd be happy to talk about that during the Q&A. I worked with Senator Randolph Bracey's team on helping to kind of put the historical content of that bill together. And it was really quite an odyssey and just such a privilege, and just a reminder about how important history is. You know, when you study what happened in Ocoee in election day for 2 days, really in November, you no longer have to make the case. You no longer have to beg people to understand that history is important. Ocoee teaches us that history matters. It matters to all of us. And I'm going to, because I'm a history prof, you know I have to give you a PowerPoint at some point. And so let me start here. And I just want to share some thoughts. And also, this is really personal to me because I'm not from Ocoee, not from Orange County. I grew up mainly on the West Coast. My wife did grow up in Homestead, Florida, in a farming family. I first came to Florida in the summer of 1994 to do oral histories with African American elders. And this is when I first started learning about the Ocoee story. One of the things I want to share with you at the outset was that the Ocoee Massacre was an international event. That is, it was internationally renowned. It was reported not only in the major newspapers of the United States, but it was reported in Europe, in Latin America, in other parts of the world. It was in part the visibility of the Ocoee Massacre in contrast to Rosewood. And I know that the Rosewood Massacre, some of us may be more familiar with that. The visibility of Ocoee is much higher in many ways because it did happen on election day. It was part of the election. It was part of that evening's election news cycle news. And it was an event which really had large resonances even beyond Florida. This is a copy of the bill, and I'd be happy to share. I know we're recording this session. I'd be happy to share my slides. This is the bill which talks about requiring that the history of Ocoee, what the state calls the Election Day riots, be part of required instruction in all of our school districts. And it was connected to also the study of the Holocaust. And this becomes part of a section of the Florida statutes, which again mandate a series of things that need to be taught, or that should be taught, or that's supposed to be taught, including the Holocaust, including Hispanic history, including the history of the Civil War, and other important events. But this is something, and you probably, if you're familiar with my work, you know that at some point an action item is going to come out of this for all of us. But it sounds to me like you're already working on that as well. So situating what happened in Ocoee statewide and nationally. In my book, Emancipation Betrayed, which Monica referred to in her introductory remarks, what happened in Ocoee, Black Ocoeans were part of a statewide social movement that African Americans organized in the wake of World War I to regain the right to vote. Mary McLeod Bethune was one of the great leaders of the statewide campaign. And I want us to think about this: 30 African Americans in 35 counties in the state organized local voter registration movements. That is, for men paying their poll taxes, getting registered to vote. Women did not have to pay poll taxes because this was the first national election that women voted in the state of Florida. So they didn't have to pay any kind of back poll tax. Remember, the poll tax was a scam. It was part of a political corruption plan to keep Black people from voting. It was cumulative, but again, women were not subjected to that retroactive poll tax. But Mrs. Bethune was very famous for saying something which was essentially, eat your bread without butter, but pay your poll tax, for heaven's sakes. And she was a person who always emphasized political activism, Black economic self-empowerment, pride, dignity, courage. And she was a leader not only, and I have to correct a lot of folks. I've been doing a lot of interviews out of state with people in the New York Times and other places. There's a major documentary that I'm being interviewed, I think this weekend for in Daytona. I try to emphasize to people, Mary McLeod Bethune she was a great educator, a great college president, but she was an internationally renowned leader. And that's how I think we really need to situate her. But she was organizing not only in Daytona, but really statewide. And she's the president of the statewide Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. She's the leader of the Southeastern Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. She's a national leader of the same organization as well. The argument that Black Ocoeans make in terms of getting registered to vote, and remember how hard it is to make that pitch. I mean, many of us on this talk tonight have went to help work in voter registration efforts. We get our clipboards, our voter registration blanks. We go to meetings, we go to the county fair, we go downtown, and we ask people to register to vote. It's a civic engagement kind of thing. But now imagine you're asking African Americans in the state of Florida to register to vote in the weeks leading up to the 1920 election. What does that mean? If you ask a Black Floridian to register to vote, what you're doing it in the state that has the highest lynching rate per capita in the entire nation. You're doing it in a state where anti-Black violence is not only almost a routine kind of horrific event, but it's sanctioned by the state. I draw upon the work of Hannah Arendt, the great philosopher and the great analyst of the origins of the Holocaust, to explain anti-Black violence in Florida. And what Dr. Arendt said is that the origins of the Holocaust may be found in colonialism, anti-Black racism, especially in Africa. As the European powers colonized the rest of the world in Asia and Africa and the Middle East, they generated ideologies of inequality, of racial superiority. And those ideologies were brought home with them after they practiced them upon the colonized peoples of places like Algeria or Egypt or Southeast Asia, what was used to be known as French Indochina. And so Dr. Hannah Arendt said it's no surprise that as the Europeans brought these ideologies of racial superiority and inferiority back home, this paved the way for the Nazi Holocaust. And in the United States, again, if you ask a Black person to register to vote in 1920, you're asking them to risk their lives. And so it was very dangerous to try to do so. The governor of the state at the time, Governor Sidney Katz, was a bad man. I'll just say that. He was anti-Catholic, he was anti-Black. He actually, when he ran for governor, he bragged about killing a Black man. He was really the kind of character who you knew was not going to be on your side if you were an African American. This is what Mrs. Bethune, this is what Black Ocoeans, this is what tens of thousands of African Americans are organizing to defeat in 1920, in the months leading up to that election campaign. They're trying to break through. They're trying to defeat one-party rule. They're trying to regain the right to vote. They're trying to regain the right to have a decent education for their children. They're trying to essentially crush Jim Crow. And the argument that Mrs. Bethune makes is, and it's important to understand, she's making this argument even before tens of thousands of Black men will disembark to fight the war in France, right? And what Mrs. Bethune says even before Black or white men are conscripted for World War I service in Europe is, look, we have fought in all of your wars from the very beginning of this nation's history. And every time we go and fight, we come back and we ask for equal rights, and you spit at us and you tell us, no, you're going to have to wait. This time, Mrs. Bethune said, it's going to be different. And I talk about this in Emancipation Betrayed. And the thing I want you to understand this evening is that this demand is led by women. This demand is led by Black women. Mrs. Bethune and her fellow organizers within the Florida Federation of Colored Women's Clubs and other Black women's organizations. The history books, some of them say that Black men came back from World War I service demanding equality. And that's true, but it's important to understand that it's Black women who are the ones who really originate that demand, okay? And so connecting Black war service in World War I to the Civil War, to the American Revolution, to the War of 1812, et cetera, et cetera. There are many different statewide organizers of the 1920 voter registration movement. In Emancipation Betrayed, I talk about Matthew Louis. He was a local, he was very active here in Alachua County, and then he moved to Pensacola. I stress in this statewide movement, this was an intergenerational movement. This is what gave the Black voter registration movement in Florida so much power. It wasn't just young people getting organized. It was people like Matthew Louis, a Civil War combat veteran who had been an elected official during Reconstruction during the 1870s. And here he is in 1920 in Jacksonville, helping to register younger African Americans to vote and teaching them basic principles of citizenship. Moses Norman and July Perry were two of the leaders of the Black voter registration movement in Ocoee proper, and I want to talk about them a little bit. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to read an excerpt from a speech that I gave at the 100th anniversary of the commemoration of the Ocoee Massacre, in which I talk about Moses Norman and July Perry. I want to say a few words about Mr. Perry and Mr. Norman, martyrs in the voter registration movement in Ocoee, because it's very important that we remember their example today. We know that July Perry and Moses Norman were lodge members, and that lodges played pivotal roles in the 1920 election. Black lodges, secret societies, and fraternal orders and labor unions pooled resources members to pay poll taxes. African-American lodges like the Knights of Pythias, the Masons, the Daughters of Eastern Star were the outstanding practitioners of mutual aid and community building in rural areas and cities alike in the Gulf South. Moses Norman and July Perry were part of an extraordinary cohort of organizers in Florida who successfully urged their Black fellow citizens to register to vote. It took incredible courage for an African-American to become a qualified voter in Florida. When you asked a Black person to register to vote in Florida in 1920, you were asking them to risk their life and their livelihood. Florida had the highest per capita lynching rate in the entire nation, higher than Georgia, higher than Alabama, higher than Mississippi. Black Floridians were routinely assassinated in the years leading up to 1920 simply for talking assertively to a white person. And if you've had the opportunity to go to the Equal Justice Initiative National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, you know what I'm talking about. There's many examples of lynching, anti-Black lynching there. What African Americans in Ocoee did in attempting to register to vote in 1920 is an incredible example of civic engagement. No student will ever take the responsibilities of citizenship lightly after a deep dive into the history of Moses Norman, July Perry, and the Florida voter registration movement. The fact that Mr. Norman and Mr. Perry were able to encourage so many people to become qualified voters in Western Orange County, and one day I hope we are able to find out exactly how many there were, speaks volumes. It speaks about the trust that they had earned from their neighbors, but above all, it speaks about the faith and the hope that African Americans in Western Orange County had that they were willing to risk their lives to build a better day. Now, this next part gets to the origins of the massacre in itself. And I have argued, if you've read Emancipation Betrayed or you've seen any of my recent lectures on the matter, this was a premeditated massacre. This was not the work of a white mob. This was not the work of angry white people that just got angry because Black people in Western Orange County were trying to vote. It was premeditated. And let me talk, I'll give a couple different examples of the premeditation. And this situates Ocoee with other anti-Black pogroms and massacres that took place between or around this time period. Infuriated by the presence or persistence of African Americans in Ocoee, the Ku Klux Klan mobilized in the weeks leading up to the 1920 election. A month before Election Day, the KKK began warning the African American community in Ocoee that, quote, not a single Negro would be permitted to vote. Local Democrats in Ocoee claimed that the Black voter registration campaign had made African Americans too assertive in their interactions with whites, and they plotted to rig the election. So here there's threats of violence, but also there are premeditated efforts to rig the election day machinery to try to stop Black voting. For example, this was a passage I took from Lester Dabb. Lester Dabb, some of you may know, was the mayor of Ocoee in the late 1960s, wrote an incredible senior thesis about the massacre. He says that in preparation for the expected attempts by the Negroes to vote on Election Day in 1920, The political leaders of the community had taken the necessary precautions to preclude the possibility of a Negroes being able to vote. These leaders had, for instance, stationed persons at the polls whose job it was to challenge the vote of any Negro making an effort to exercise the franchise. This challenge would then necessitate the Negroes appearing before a notary republic. In this case, Justice of the Peace, R.C. Bigelow. The concluding preparation of the whites was to arrange for the Honorable Mr. Bigelow to vote early and then conveniently go fishing, thus making it necessary for any Negro desirous of voting to make the long trip into Orlando. So this is a premeditated action to try to stop African Americans from voting, and then also to threaten them if they actually have the courage to go through with this effort to try to vote. What was it about Black voting that white supremacists and at the level of the Democratic Party fought so hard to stop them from voting? What was it that disturbed them about Black voting? Now, if we had more time, I'd get more deeply into this, but briefly, this requires us to kind of take a step backwards into Reconstruction. And why was it that the Democratic Party at that time, and the Republican Party, frankly, ends up colluding with the Democratic Party? Why was the white ruling class so determined to keep Black people from voting? And why is Black voter suppression a continuing theme in American history? It gets back to this episode in the 1880s. In the 1880s, African Americans joined with dissident whites to put together what's called the Independent Party of Florida. I talk about this in chapter 2 of Emancipation Betrayed. This is going to be an interracial political party to break the power of the party of white supremacy. And the capstone, if you will, of their demands is an equal educational system for all children of Florida. That's what makes them so revolutionary in 1884. They're asking for complete equality in education, not second-class schools. They're also asking for fair representation on juries, voting rights, et cetera, et cetera. But it's that education demand which makes them so very revolutionary. Because you see, education is really the linchpin in many ways of the Jim Crow system in Florida and in other states. And these statistics are just one of many examples that we could talk about that demonstrate the devastating impact of segregation on African American communities, but also explain why Black voter suppression was such a powerful force, especially in the politics of the American South. You can see here that Black communities are literally being drained of resources that are going to some white schools, not all, because even the white schools themselves are not equal. But look at Alachua County here. This is information that I called from the census. In 1930, for example, African Americans in Alachua County, my county, where Gainesville is the county seat, compose almost 44% of the population. The expenditure per white people is $28.27. Expenditure for black people is $5.90. You can look at the value of schools, all the way up and down the line. It's a pretty shocking disparity. If you don't know anything about the Jim Crow South, if you somehow were miseducated into thinking that, oh, this was a separate but equal system, it was anything but. And so these were the things that Mary McLeod Bethune and others were fighting against as they struggled to regain the right to vote for all Black Floridians. These were some of the goals, was to break this system of educational inequality. Now, we would be remiss if we just confined our critique of where Black voter suppression really comes from, where it emanates from, where it gets its power in this country. It isn't just in the South. It's a national phenomenon. Before the Civil War, every northern state at one point or the other attempts to crush or to rob African American people, men in this case, of course, of the right to vote. It's not just a Southern thing, okay? And so Charles Francis Adams is actually, of course, as you know, many of you know, the grandson of John Adams, the first president, the son of John Quincy Adams. His father was a president. Charles Francis Adams has no use for universal suffrage. And in that, he's pretty much in the consensus among ruling class white Americans in the 19th century. Andrew Carnegie is another person who white leaders in Florida just love the heck out of Andrew Carnegie, because he's kind of like a walking time bomb of anti-Black quotes. The irony here is that, well, it may not even be an irony. I mean, Carnegie actually gives a certain amount of funding to Tuskegee Institute. He counts Booker T. Washington as a friend, but he wants to make it clear that Black people have no business whatsoever voting. So Andrew Carnegie, really the most powerful industrialist of his time, and really in American history up to Henry Ford, not a believer in universal principles whatsoever. And again, the Florida Times Union and Florida newspapers love this man. They quote him very often because he's kind of a walking time bomb of anti-Black and anti-immigrant statements. Another great leader, and I'll just kind of go through these kind of quickly, and again, you'll have the presentation, you kind of look at it at your leisure. It's a remarkable group of organizers all throughout the state of Florida. I've talked about Moses Norman, July Perry, Emma Collier in Orlando is another very, very influential organizer of the Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. W.S. Stevens in Gadsden County, a heavily rural Black majority Panhandle County near to the west of Tallahassee, is a leader. It's a cross-class movement. Dr. Stevens is a medical doctor, but there are union leaders, there are cooks, there are maids, there are janitors, all across the state who are heavily active in building the NAACP, because if you read Emancipation Betrayed, you'll see that's another part of this drama, this is where the NAACP comes into its own in the Deep South. In Florida, the organization is helped mightily by James Weldon Johnson. Of course, he grew up in Jacksonville. He knows Florida. He comes through, he organizes NAACP chapter in Broward County. He organizes NAACP chapter in Gainesville. He is a beloved, nationally renowned leader by this time, like Mrs. Bethune, and a person that people trust, and a person that people will really say, okay, we've got to get moving here. And James Weldon Johnson is one of those amazing figures who's very active in the 1924 voter registration campaign. Again, the centrality of women organizers all throughout the state of Florida. We kind of flash now to Jacksonville in 1920. If you look at these are different episodes in the theater of democracy. So in Jacksonville, Eartha M.M. White is a legendary community and political organizer. And while she's working on anti-poverty initiatives, she's also going around urging Black men to get registered to vote and telling Black women that the 19th Amendment is coming and we have to be ready. And Black women are ready. This is one of the inspiring things about the 1920 voter registration campaign, is that the day that Black women become eligible to go and register to vote, they show up by the thousands in cities like Orlando and Jacksonville and Miami and Pensacola, by the thousands and tens of thousands. And the white supremacist power structure, in the Orlando Sentinel, all the major white controlled newspapers are stunned. They're like, what is, these Negro women we're gonna have a revolution of washerwomen. That's the phrase you hear very often in the mainstream white dominated newspapers. So they strike back. And how I would situate the Ocoee Massacre is to think about it. Obviously, it's distinctive. It happens in one place, but it's part of a national series of anti-Black terrorist activities that sweep the nation during this time period. And many of you have heard about Red Summer. 1919 is kind of the epicenter of a lot of anti-Black violence. But also Ocoee 1920, Tulsa 1921, Perry, Rosewood, And you go back earlier, East St. Louis, Philadelphia, Forsyth County, Georgia. This is a partial list of anti-Black pogroms, cases where large numbers of Black people are driven out by white people. And again, these are not mobs. I'm trying to modify the language that historians use here. These are paramilitary operations. Ocoee, we have descriptions of the American Legion, of white military veterans taking part in the activities. As a third generation military veteran myself, I can tell you that people, men don't go into communities that they don't know without having a sense of being able to have ammunition, to be resupplied, to be able to reload weaponry. Men didn't walk around with 100 rounds of ammunition. They didn't walk around with incendiary devices. They wouldn't have known who and how to get the leaders and kind of root them out. So what I'm describing to you are things like logistics, right? Intelligence, resupply, quartermaster types of efforts. And all of these cases, the violence against Black people is sustained. It's not violence that's engaged upon by people who just get upset and out of the blue say, I'm so angry at Black people trying to vote, I'm going to go burn down their community. No, that's not it. These are all cases of premeditated anti-Black violence. And I think that the state of Florida recognized this. I think we nailed it and made the case. And I think that was part of the reason behind the bill to require the teaching of what happened in Ocoee. And again, I'm trying to get us to understand that Ocoee is part of a larger context of anti-Black violence. And if you want to know why this happened during this particular time period, the answer is pretty simple. Dr. Du Bois nails it in an essay he writes called The Politics of Negro Disenfranchisement. And what he says is that despite white supremacy, despite anti-Black segregation, the Negro has made remarkable gains in Black land ownership, in the number of farms we own, in the number of businesses we have started, in the number of the members of labor unions that our people are now part of. And these acts of violence, which clustered between 1917 and 1923, were designed to drive back Black economic and political progress. It's as simple as that. I wish there was a more complicated explanation, but it's basically as simple as that right there. What makes it hard now to study the Ocoee Massacre and like the Elaine Massacre in the Arkansas Delta, for example. I just took 16 University of Florida students to Phillips County, Arkansas, where we're helping the community there commemorate and remember and teach about the Elaine Massacre. That massacre occurred in 1919. It involved federal troops coming to Phillips County and murdering Black farmers, and by the scores and maybe even by the hundreds. The problem is, and I'll anticipate a question that I'm asked everywhere I go to talk about Ocoee or Elaine or Longview or other anti-Black massacres, the problem we have in trying to reconstruct them today is that all of these were part of official cover-up activities. What I mean by this is that the normal kind of organs of the law, of the media, of civil society, which should come together to try to figure out when there's an explosion of violence, when people are literally driven out of a town or a community, and white people line the roads in Western Orange County as Black Ocoeans were driven out of Western Orange County in the days and weeks after the massacre. Black people would gather all of their belongings and put them on jitneys or hacks or mule-drawn carriages. And as they would leave the area, white people would gather to mock them because many white people in that area saw Ocoee as almost like a Civil War kind of victory in many ways. And NAACP Walter White actually witnessed this happening when he came and did an undercover investigation of what had happened in Ocoee. But again, Ocoee is far from distinct. It's far from unique. It's a catastrophic event, which unfortunately is very common in US history. but it provides us with incredible opportunities to relearn our history. I had to relearn my history. You know, as a PhD candidate at Duke University, I was not prepared to learn this story. It was local people, local African Americans and progressive white folks who insisted that I learn this story. The first time, and I talk about this in a forthcoming essay, the first time I was invited to Ocoee was when I was a graduate student at Duke University, and I was sworn to secrecy. The people who brought me in Ocoee told me, look, we don't want you to write about this visit. We don't want you to tell people you're on your way to Ocoee. We don't want you to tell people until we kind of let you know it's okay that you were here and that we showed you evidence about the Ocoee Massacre. And remember, this is in 1996 and 1997. And it was a moving experience. I mean, they took me to places where Black people had lived and were literally plowed over, and orange groves were planted where they had once lived. And I mean, I wept. I mean, I've seen, I was in special forces in Central America in the mid 1980s. And I was in combat zones. I saw people die, but I'd never seen anything like this before in my entire life. An entire community, not only destroyed and people driven out, but then plowed over. And here was the continuity. Here was the connection between Ocoee and Elaine and Longview and Tulsa, et cetera, et cetera. Before the massacre, Black people owned land. They owned businesses. They built churches. They have lodge buildings. After the massacre, they're expropriated. They lose their land. And that land and those belongings accrued to wealthy white individuals. Again, it's not like the white community is sharing equally amongst itself. That land and those resources that's expropriated from Black people somehow ends up in the hands of wealthy white institutions, wealthy white individuals. And the pattern is the same almost everywhere you study. Again, Tulsa, Elaine, Ocoee, Rosewood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what we have now is an opportunity to relearn history, to bring Ocoee in, to place it at the center of how we understand US history. US history is a history of struggle. The idea that we get right, that the government grants us rights, oh, no, 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 no. You study African-American history, you learn a different kind of history, a history where rights are contingent, they're fragile. And what you win in one generation, you can lose in the next generation. It encourages us to be active. I mean, I would never in my life, after I'd interviewed African-American elders and talked to the elders of my own family who used to be Jim Crow in the 40s and 50s, I would never take voting for granted. I mean, I could never afford to do that. Because many of the people that I interviewed were people who were the first people in their communities to vote. They risked their lives to put their names on a piece of paper to try to vote. But unless you know that history, voting doesn't seem to be that big a deal. Oh, we've always had the right to vote in America. That's what a lot of my freshmen at UF think. They come into my classes and they're like, wow, we've always had the right to vote. I'm like, no. So Ocoee gives us the opportunity to really kind of relearn our history. And I talk here about Amendment 4. Many of you were involved in that struggle. The call to action is to really think about how we can continue to provide content and really make this new part of the Florida education statute a reality. How do we get this taught in our schools? How do we make sure in K-6 schools in Broward County, in Alachua County, in Broward, et cetera, how do we make sure this is taught? You don't have to be a teacher, right? You can be a concerned citizen and ask your school board, ask your school, your neighborhood school, ask your school board members. How can we help here? How can we make sure that this horrific incident, which has terrible parts of it, right? The massacre part, but also has these incredible heroic elements as well. people risking their lives to exercise rights that many of us today take for granted. I think it really needs to be taught. And at this point, I'll go ahead and stop my share and open it up for questions. And I think I had also, I wanted to share with you, I'll just put the URL. A couple of things as we're thinking about questions or comments. In the chat bar, I'm going to put the link to the Orange County Regional History Center, which did a fabulous exhibit about the Ocoee Massacre. And part of that may be coming online. You can contact them. Pam Schwartz is a person, I did some consulting with them on the exhibit. But that's a really good resource to learn more about this history. So thank you for your patience. I know I've talked for quite a while, so I'll go ahead and try to put myself on pause and see if there are any thoughts or ideas or feelings.
So does anyone have any questions? If you're like me, you were just so absorbed, I didn't even think about putting something in chat. So, okay, I see one question here from Susan Adams. Oops, I lost it. Says, what can you tell us about the involvement? Not sure. Oh, here it is. Involvement of the Harold McGuire family.
I don't know about the Harold McGuire. I've forgotten about it. Or Susan, what can you tell us about the Harold McGuire family?
I am a transplant from Ohio who ended up as a child growing up in Ocoee in '58. And that was a difficult aspect in and of itself because Yankees definitely were not welcome. And especially, I think, probably because of the secrets that had to be kept. And they didn't trust Yankees to keep secrets. And so, anyway, and they were right about that, I think. But at any rate, there was a family living in Ocoee at the time. I believe they're all deceased now, but at any rate, there is a story about Harold McGuire's father, who allegedly several members who were fleeing their homes came to his house for help. He was an employer in the community. I don't believe he had groves. I think he had another business, but he was an employer in the community, and they came to him. They trusted him, and he told them to come in his house and stay, and barred the door. And when the self-appointed posse, so to speak, came to the McGuire home, the story that his daughter related in her book about Ocoee history is that her father told them that he would kill the posse members rather than allow them to come into his house. And then when it was safe, he was able to put them in his vehicle. He was wealthy and he had a vehicle, and he put the black members who came to his house, he put them in his vehicle and was able to get them out of the area safely. But there are different stories. There are different stories about that. But the one his daughter tells, and you know, from what I've been able, and Lester Dabbs was my social studies teacher when I was in the high school there. So that's how we learned about it in the '60s, actually.
Yeah. You know, Lester, and actually, I'm so glad now you jog my memory, Susan, about McGuire. And I wanted to read, with your permission, an excerpt from Lester's MA thesis, because it's just so powerful. because he talks about what it was like to teach in Ocoee. And he says the following. Of course, he wrote this in 1969. At present, the Ocoee Junior Senior High School is the only secondary school in the county without at least token integration, even though the principal and the researcher, and here he's referring to himself, Lester Dabbs, have attended desegregation institutes at Stetson University at one time or another. Many adults and students of the community are proud of the fact that the local Klan unit was the third one formed in the state. They are proud that the local resident cited by Congress in its recent hearings, and they are proud of the two area units of the United Klans of America. And, you know, Lester, I'm just so blessed to have been able to get to know him. You know, when I came back to Ocoee in 2010 to do the keynote for the MLK convocation, which is, you know, is just a wonderful event. And that's when I first had a chance to really sit down and talk to Lester Dabbs. And I just had this sense of this really, I think, a really courageous man who carried this burden for so many years. He said, Paul, you just don't know what it's like. He said, I would try to talk to people who I knew had been deputy sheriffs or in law enforcement in 1920. And I would try to talk to them about this event. And they would say, what are you talking about? We don't remember that happening, you know, and the way he described it was kind of like a haunted landscape. But yeah, I'm glad you brought up that very important story. Looking at the chat bar, just a couple quick responses. Is there curriculum or materials available at the Florida Department of Education website? To my knowledge, not yet. I just checked there for another reason, which I'll get to in a moment. The Florida Humanities Council, though, and again, the Orange County, the Regional History Center is developing exhibits, curriculum materials. And so that material is kind of coming together. But again, we really need more of a systematic push. Unfortunately, at the statewide level right now, so much energy is being put into trying to make sure that we don't teach critical race theory in K through 12. We weren't teaching it to begin with, and making sure that the 1619 curriculum isn't implemented. Now, I put in the chat bar a lecture that I just gave, actually, the United Church of Christ, or United Church in Gainesville, which basically I talk about this issue of critical race theory. And I argue that the recent statewide directive eventually is going to be struck down, because they're telling K through 12 teachers, you can't really teach about racism as part of a systemic oppression. You can only teach it as a matter of individual bias. And my argument is that it's impossible to understand the Holocaust or slavery or segregation if you only teach it as a case of individual bias. I mean, what would that even look like, right? So that, again, I gave a long-winded answer to a very direct question. Is there curriculum or materials available at the FLDOE website? No, not at this point. But we hope that it's going to take some pressure. You know, I think we're going to have to really, you know, it's been suggested at the local school board level, but I think it's going to take some statewide pressure as well on the Florida DOE to kind of get back on point with this, to say that if we're going to have content and materials for teachers to teach about Ocoee, to teach about slavery, to teach about the Holocaust and Hispanic history, that's another part of that unfunded mandate. We're really going to need the Florida Department of Education to focus. Like if you're a teacher, right, how we tell your students, focus. We've got to tell the state of Florida, focus on education. Don't worry about the 2024 GOP presidential race. That's coming down the road. For now, focus on the education of our state's children.
So there's another question from Katie. The Groveland Ford incident took place in Central Florida in the 50s. And there doesn't seem to have been much enlightenment between, you know, what occurred in the 20s and the 50s. And then, of course, Governor DeSantis still won't exonerate the Groveland Four. Is there any reason to be hopeful?
Yes, because we have gradually pushed the state of Florida to recognize that some bad things have happened in the state, that state officials took part in those bad things. You know, one of them is the Groveland Floor incident. Obviously, bad thing would be a dramatic understatement. You know, but I think about how the state of Florida now has begun to acknowledge, they of course have, as you point out, have not exonerated the Groveland Four, but that's just a great argument for that. We got to keep up pressure. I mean, let me give you another example, the Rosewood Massacre. So when I first arrived here in the summer of 1994, and I was doing field work in the Panhandle, it was just an electric atmosphere because the survivors of the Rosewood Massacre had just given testimony in the state legislature in Tallahassee about their experience about the Rosewood Massacre. And it was incredible. But what it took to get them there, the support, the legal support, it was Martha Barnett, who I've interviewed, you know, the second female president of the American Bar Association. The firm that she was a part of then was a famous firm that does pro bono work. I'm blanking. What was the firm Martha was with? But anyway, the work of the NAACP, you know, progressive white organization, everyone kind of pitching in to make sure that that testimony was given. And that's what it took. And I think the same thing with the Ocoee Massacre. We have a bill that was passed, but we also have a lot of dissatisfaction about it because part of that original iteration of the Ocoee bill was also to talk about the issue of compensation. That here you have the state of Florida played a really important role in suppressing the vote. Now, and there should be some compensation to the descendants of the victims of the Ocoee Massacre. This is not an event that happened 400 or 500 years ago, right? This happened within the last century. And so it's very possible to come up with lists of survivors. It's very possible, and this is what the Orange County Regional Historical Center has done some great work in actually plotting out where, you know, Black-owned land that was lost in Western Orange County. So the data is coming in. You know, I'm not an expert on that part. I'm not, you know, a historian of Orange County per se, but I can tell you that the groundwork has been done. And so the same thing with the Groveland Four, the same thing with Dozier Boys School. You know, the same thing with the Angola Maroon runaway slave settlement, right down by Manatee. I mean, there's all these incredible events of African-American history that, you know, are all kind of community centered and community involved events. So yeah, there is hope. I think that, you know, for me as a historian, the Black Lives Matter movement has given me tremendous hope because, I mean, once the Black Lives Matter movement started, I lost control of my schedule forever, it seems. I mean, I couldn't have done all the lectures that I've been doing nationwide without this modality, without Zoom and Skype and Microsoft Teams and other platforms I'm not even familiar with, right? But the Black Lives Matter movement, a big part of that, and it's a global movement. That's the important thing about, one of the important things about Black Lives Matter, is it's really pushed us to look at ourselves in the mirror and to understand why history matters. And that's been such an important part of the movement. And I think that's part of the impetus behind this law from Governor DeSantis and Mr. Corcoran against critical race theory. Is this they're trying to put the batten down the hatches, to borrow C lingo. Okay, they're trying to put us back to where we were in 2019 or 2018, and they don't like people digging too deeply into the history. But unless you dig, and this is what people of Ocoee have taught me over the years. I mean, look, when I first went to Ocoee, and I've talked about this in print, when I was there in 2010, I had a very mixed reception. And you remember, Susan, you remember Mayor Vandergrift, a very fascinating individual. We had many long conversations. We had one conversation, which I do talk about in this forthcoming essay. I thought he did the best he could with what he had to do at the time. But I remember sitting down with him in the Ocoee, in the famous eatery, the diner, right? And it was like lunch with he and his wife and my wife, Sheila. And if you know my wife, Sheila is a longtime political activist, and she has a very different style of personal engagement than I do. It's much more direct. And Mayor Vandergrift kept on saying, well, Paul, I have a bone to pick with you. I don't like this term you use, massacre. What happened in Ocoee, because there were some white individuals who were killed. And I said, well, Mr. Mayor, that's true. But I'm going to tell you where I grew up. If you come on my doorstep and you bang on the door and you demand me to come out, and there's a bunch of people with guns, I'm going to defend myself. And so I just want to let you know that. And I do think, I'm pretty sure it was a massacre. We have all the evidence. And we went back and forth and back and forth. And finally, my wife just put her foot down and she said, look, Paul has 100 pages of footnotes in that book. If what he said was a massacre, it was a massacre. And that kind of ended the discussion right there. But essentially, it was oral histories with African Americans. And again, Pam Schwartz and the Orange County Regional Center have just done such a great service in kind of collating and doing oral histories. I want to mention too here that oral histories with descendants is really important. Susan, you mentioned a really important story with the McGuire family. Those are the types of stories that we really need to, I think, emphasize now. I want to try to learn more about what happened the day of the massacre, but because of the cover-up and because there's no grand jury proceeding, the evidence is really was a lot of it was destroyed. It's going to be, and don't misunderstand me, I want us to continue digging, right, about the events leading up to November 2nd, 1920. But I don't want us to forget the legacies, the multiple legacies, that period of when the town was a sundown town, right, that Lester talked about in his thesis. But then the opening up, what it took to get the Ocoee story into public discourse in Western Orange County, to me, turns out to be just such an incredibly important story. The parallel is Tulsa in some ways. The parallel is Elaine County or East St. Louis in 1917. How do engaged people develop the capacity, which includes compassion, which does include anger, which does include just really, I was in discussions about Ocoee in the early 2000s where people would just get up and walk away. They're so angry, in tears, weeping, and that is okay, because what happened to Black people in Ocoee should make you weep. It should make you weep for them. It should make you weep for the entire nation that covered up that atrocity. But that's a necessary process. And if people can do it there, my gosh, I feel like I'm still kind of an outsider, when I go to Ocoee, but in many ways, people have really embraced me and they've said, well, Paul's going to say some things that are going to make you a little uncomfortable, but you got, you got to listen to him. And as a teacher, as a history teacher, that's just so edifying. I mean, it's just so inspiring. Again, it's not easy work, but I think it's part of that racial truth and reconciliation work that groups like the Equal Justice Initiative are really helping us do. Now, I feel like I'm on that history prof ramble again, so I apologize. I'm kind of put myself on pause again for anyone has questions or.
I think it's just fascinating. There is a question. Katie is wondering, is the Ocoee Massacre history included in high school textbooks across the country?
I don't know, Kate. I haven't seen yet. my hope is that, right now, maybe the next iteration of high school textbooks, and certainly we've got to find a way to get into the Florida history textbooks. And it's got to be taught before students get to, our college and university classrooms, and they'll say, I never heard about this, and we got to find a way to get it into those textbooks. But I don't know of any examples yet. I would be overjoyed if there were some.
I know I didn't feel like I had learned anything about history until I got to college. And so what you were talking about before we started the meeting, that it's really in that grade school level that we need to start teaching this information. And I think that's a really good point. It seemed like everything we had in high school was pretty whitewashed, and I think it still is, pun intended.
And kids know, they kind of know.
They're smarter than we think they are. Are there any other questions? I know it gives us a lot to think about. You have to know Mary McLeod Bethune is one of our heroes here in Broward County. That's what she's actually, her book, the book by Ashley Preston.
Oh,
It's part, yeah. Ashley spoke to the Florida League a couple weeks ago, and then we're reading her book in the book club right now.
Excellent. It's an excellent book.
So, and a number of items here, thank you for educating us. I totally agree with that. I think these are so many things that we just don't know about our own, even our own histories, even what our families have been involved with. And we don't talk to our elders enough. Okay, are there any last questions? If not, thank you, Paul. It was very enlightening. And the book is great. You guys, I started on it. It makes you cry in places. There is no doubt about it, but you have to read it. It really is very, very good.
Thank you, Margaret, for that kind. I'm also going to put the link to the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program in the chat bar. If you want to learn more about our oral history program at UF, we love collaboration. If you have thoughts, we're actually the national, we're the repository for the National Women's March Archive. We sent a team of students up to Washington, D.C. to actually document the National Women's March in D.C. And then we started working with the nationwide network. And so we actually have oral history interviews with women organizers all across the country, that worked at the regional marches. And so that's one of the projects that we work on, and that we just really just enjoy, and we're kind of building on that. So please check us out. And I'll put my email contact in the chat bar before I kind of sign off here. And, please contact me at any time, or kind of look over the Proctor program. And I would love to collaborate with you all on projects. We have great students. I love to listen to organizers and learn from, people who are in organizations. So, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording now.